Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing on the African savanna 300,000 years ago. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The air is thick with the smell of dry grass and distant rain. In the fading light you see them, a small group of figures moving across the landscape. They walk upright like you. They carry tools. They communicate with each other in ways that sound almost familiar. You're looking at the first members of our species, Homo sapiens, the very first humans, and they're here in Africa, not Europe, not Asia, not some lost continent swallowed by the ocean, Africa. This is where it all began, where you began, where every single person who has ever lived began. But here's the question that should keep you up at night, except you're probably trying to fall asleep, so maybe it's the perfect question. Why? Why Africa specifically? Out of all the places on Earth, all the continents, all the environments, why did humanity emerge from this one place? And more importantly, what aren't we being told about it? See, there's a story you've probably heard before, the mainstream narrative. It goes something like this. Humans evolved in Africa, developed bigger brains, created tools, and eventually spread across the world. Simple, clean, case closed. And that's all true. The evidence is overwhelming. The fossils don't lie. The DNA doesn't lie. Africa is absolutely, undeniably where humanity began. But that's just the surface. That's the story they teach in textbooks. The sanitized version that fits neatly into a documentary or a museum exhibit. What they don't tell you about are the mysteries that don't fit the neat narrative, the discoveries that got quietly shelved, the theories that make mainstream scientists uncomfortable, the ancient sites in Africa that predate what should be possible, the genetic anomalies that suggest our story is far more complex than we've been led to believe. There are layers to this story. Deep layers, and we're going to explore them all. Now, before you think this is going to be some wild conspiracy theory about aliens or Atlantis, let me be clear. We're not abandoning science here. We're going deeper into it. We're looking at the legitimate questions that researchers whisper about at conferences, but hesitate to publish. We're examining the gaps in the fossil record that are so large you could hide entire civilizations in them. We're following the genetic trails that lead to places the textbooks haven't caught up with yet. Because here's the thing about Africa and human origins. The more we dig, literally and figuratively, the stranger the story becomes. Every major discovery in the past decade hasn't simplified our understanding. It's complicated it. That genetic bottleneck we talked about, that's just the beginning. There are older mysteries, deeper secrets, evidence of human behavior that shows up hundreds of thousands of years before it's supposed to. Tools that are too sophisticated for their time. Art that predates art. Symbols that suggest abstract thinking long before we thought abstract thinking was possible. And then there are the stories, not the ones written in academic journals, but the ones passed down through generations of African peoples. Stories about the first humans, about ancient catastrophes, about times when the world was different, about knowledge that was lost. Some of these stories, when you put them next to the latest archaeological discoveries, they line up in ways that are impossible to ignore. So why did humanity begin in Africa? The simple answer is climate, geography, and evolutionary pressure. But the real answer, the complete answer, is far more fascinating. It involves a perfect storm of conditions that existed nowhere else on Earth. It involves disasters that nearly ended us. It involves adaptations that shouldn't have been possible, and it might involve chapters of our history that have been completely forgotten or deliberately overlooked. Over the next hour or so, we're going to walk through this story together. Not just the version you've heard, but the fuller, stranger, more mysterious version. The one that sits in the uncomfortable space between established fact and tantalizing possibility. We're going to visit the cradle of humanity, and we're going to discover that the cradle is far deeper and more complex than anyone ever told you. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's go back, way back, to the place where everything began. For most of human history, nobody questioned where we came from. Every culture had its creation stories, its myths about the first people emerging from mountains or rivers or the hands of gods. But the actual geographical origin of humanity, that wasn't even a question people thought to ask. Then something changed. In the 19th century, science began asking uncomfortable questions. Questions that would challenge everything people believed about themselves, their superiority, their place in the world. And one question became more controversial than any other. Where did humans actually come from? The answer, when it first emerged, was so disturbing to European sensibilities that it would take nearly a century for the scientific establishment to accept it. Even when the evidence became overwhelming, even when fossils and bones piled up in ways that couldn't be denied, the resistance continued. Because the answer pointed somewhere that Victorian scientists found almost unthinkable. Africa. Charles Darwin saw it first. In 1871, more than a decade after he'd published On the Origin of Species, Darwin published The Descent of Man. And in that book he made a prediction that would haunt anthropology for generations. He suggested, based on pure logic and the distribution of great apes, that humans probably originated in Africa, not Europe, not Asia, Africa. The response was immediate and hostile. Darwin's critics and even many of his supporters dismissed the idea almost out of hand. Why would humans have originated in Africa? Everyone knew that Africans were, well, less advanced. Surely humanity must have begun somewhere more civilized. Somewhere in Europe, perhaps, or Asia, anywhere but Africa. This wasn't just scientific disagreement. This was racial prejudice dressed up in academic robes. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the height of European imperialism. Colonial powers were busy carving up Africa, justifying their exploitation with theories about racial hierarchies and the white man's burden. The idea that all humans, including white Europeans, had originated in Africa, that we were all Africans fundamentally, that was intolerable, so Darwin's prediction was filed away and mostly forgotten. The search for human origins focused elsewhere. Piltdown in England, where a suspicious skull fragment seemed to confirm European origins until it was exposed as a fraud decades later. Java, China, anywhere but Africa. Then in 1924, something happened that should have changed everything. A limestone quarry in Taung, South Africa, produced a small skull, the skull of a child, with both ape-like and human-like features. It was unlike anything scientists had seen before. The specimen ended up with Raymond Dart, an anatomist working at the University of Witwatersrand, and Dart recognized immediately what he was looking at, an extinct species that was intermediate between apes and humans, a missing link. He named it Australopithecus africanus, southern ape from Africa, and he announced to the world that this was evidence of human evolution in Africa, exactly as Darwin had predicted. The scientific establishment destroyed him. Senior anthropologists dismissed the Taung child as just an ape, nothing more. They questioned Dart's credentials, his methods, his conclusions. Some suggested he'd been fooled, that he was seeing what he wanted to see. The personal attacks were vicious. Dart's career was nearly ruined. He spent years defending his findings, publishing paper after paper, trying to convince skeptics that what he'd found was real and important. Most simply refused to listen, because accepting the Taung child meant accepting African origins, and that was still, in the 1920s and 30s, too much for European science to swallow. But fossils don't care about prejudice. They just keep showing up. Through the 1930s and 40s, More discoveries emerged from South Africa. More Australopithecus fossils, more evidence of ancient human ancestors in Africa. Each discovery made the African origin hypothesis harder to dismiss. Slowly, grudgingly, the tide began to turn to, by the 1950s, even the most stubborn holdouts were starting to admit that maybe, possibly, Darwin and Dart had been right. Humanity did begin in Africa. The recognition didn't come all at once. There was no dramatic moment when everyone suddenly agreed. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of evidence, fossil after fossil, site after site, until the alternative theories simply couldn't be sustained anymore. By the 1970s, the out-of-Africa theory had become scientific consensus. We came from Africa. All of us. Every human population on Earth could trace its ancestry back to the African continent. The very place that colonial science had dismissed as backward and primitive was actually humanity's cradle, the birthplace of everything we would become. Before we go deeper into how these fossils revealed our story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something beautiful about people all over the world from every continent learning together about our shared origins in Africa. Now let's talk about those fossils, because what they revealed wasn't just where we came from, it was who we used to be. The fossil record is a strange thing. Think about it. We're trying to reconstruct millions of years of history from scattered bones, fragments really, pieces of skull here, a jawbone there, maybe if we're incredibly lucky, a mostly complete skeleton. It's like trying to understand an entire library after a fire has destroyed everything, except a few random pages from different books. And yet, from these fragments, we've managed to piece together a story so compelling, so revolutionary, that it completely transformed how we understand ourselves. November the 24th, 1974, the Afar region of Ethiopia, a place so hot, so desolate, that most people would consider it uninhabitable. Temperatures regularly hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The landscape is nothing but volcanic rock and sand. But paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson and his team were there anyway, searching for something that might not exist. Fossils of ancient human ancestors in deposits millions of years old. They'd been working for weeks, finding little fragments here and there. Nothing spectacular. Then, on that November afternoon, Johansen spotted something. A piece of arm bone sticking out of a slope. Then another bone, and another. By the time they'd carefully excavated the site, they'd found something unprecedented. 47 bones from a single individual. Nearly 40% of a complete skeleton. A female, about 3.5 feet tall, who had lived and died 3.2 million years ago. They named her Lucy, after the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds that was playing in camp that night. And Lucy changed everything. Before Lucy, we had fragments, hints that human ancestors might have walked upright millions of years ago. But Lucy was proof. Her pelvis, her leg bones, the way her knee angled inward, it all screamed bipedalism. This tiny creature, with a brain about the size of a chimpanzee's, had walked upright across the African landscape more than 3 million years before the first humans appeared. But here's what made Lucy truly revolutionary. She wasn't quite ape and wasn't quite human. She was something in between. Her arms were long and powerful, suggesting she still spent significant time in trees. But her legs and pelvis were adapted for walking on the ground. She represented a transitional form, direct evidence that humans had evolved from earlier ape-like ancestors. This wasn't theory anymore. This was bone and calcium, physical proof you could hold in your hand. The scientific community went wild. But Lucy was just the beginning. Just a few hundred miles south of where Lucy was found, in a place called Latoli in Tanzania, another discovery was waiting. This one was even more haunting, even more direct. In 1976, paleontologist Mary Leakey and her team found something that still gives researchers chills. Footprints, not fossilized bones but actual footprints, preserved in volcanic ash for 3.6 million years. Picture this. 2 individuals, possibly 3, walking across a landscape covered in fresh volcanic ash. It's probably raining. The ash is wet, sticky. As they walk, their feet sink slightly into the surface, leaving clear impressions. Then another volcanic eruption happens, covering their tracks with a new layer of ash. Over millions of years, this ash hardens into rock, preserving those footprints perfectly. When Mary Leakey's team brushed away the overlying sediment, they found a trail stretching over 88 feet. And these weren't ambiguous marks that might be footprints. These were unmistakable. Heel strike, arch, toe push-off, the gait pattern of creatures walking exactly like modern humans. Fully upright, fully bipedal, 3.6 million years ago. One detail made it even more profound. At one point, the trail shows what appears to be 2 individuals walking side by side. Their footprints overlap slightly. Maybe they were holding hands. Maybe one was supporting the other. We'll never know. But for a brief moment, frozen in time, we can see our ancestors as they actually lived, walking together across an ancient landscape, not fighting for survival, not hunting or gathering, just walking. These weren't humans yet. The footprints almost certainly belonged to Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's species, but they were our ancestors nonetheless, and they walked like we do. The discoveries kept coming. In the 1960s, Louis and Mary Leakey had been excavating at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. The place is basically a time machine, a massive ravine where millions of years of geological deposits are exposed layer by layer. In those layers, the Leakeys found something remarkable. Stone tools, crude, simple tools. Stones deliberately struck against other stones to create sharp edges, and mixed with these tools, bones, the remains of a species they called Homo habilis, handyman, because of the tools associated with the fossils. These weren't the first stone tools ever found, but these were different. They were 2.6 million years old, pushing human tool use back by hundreds of thousands of years. And they showed something crucial. The leap from Australopithecus to Homo wasn't just physical, it was cognitive. These early humans were thinking, planning, creating technology to solve problems. The tools themselves tell a story. Each one required specific knowledge. You had to understand which rocks would fracture the right way. You had to know the proper angle and force to strike. You had to be able to visualize the tool you wanted before you started making it. This was abstract thinking, mental planning, skills that separate us from almost every other species on Earth. But here's where the fossil record gets frustrating. Between Australopithecus and Homo habilis, there's a gap, not a small one. Nearly 1 million years where we have almost nothing. A few fragments, some disputed specimens, but mostly just questions. What happened during that 1 million years? How did small-brained, ape-like creatures evolve into tool-making humans? The gaps are everywhere once you start looking. Between Homo habilis and Homo erectus. Between Homo erectus and archaic Homo sapiens. Crucial transitional periods where we're essentially blind. We find species A, then millions of years later we find species B, and we have to guess what happened in between. Some researchers argue this is just the nature of fossilization. It's incredibly rare. Most individuals who die are eaten by scavengers, scattered by weather, destroyed by geological processes. For every fossil we find, millions of individuals lived and died without leaving any trace. The wonder isn't that we have gaps. The wonder is that we have anything at all. But others wonder if the gaps might hide something more interesting. Lost species that existed for thousands of generations, but left no fossils we've found yet. evolutionary experiments that failed, populations that went extinct before they could spread. The fossil record shows us the winners, the lineages that survived long enough and in large enough numbers to leave traces. But how many ghost species walked Africa during those missing millions of years? Recent discoveries keep pushing the timeline back, making the picture more complex. In 2015, researchers in South Africa announced Homo naledi, a strange mosaic of primitive and modern features. The fossils might be as young as 300,000 years old, meaning the species could have been alive at the same time as early modern humans. In 2019, a skull from Ethiopia pushed Homo sapiens back to at least 300,000 years, far older than previous estimates. Every new find answers questions but raises more. Why are the most important fossils found where they are? East Africa, the Rift Valley. This narrow corridor has produced an overwhelming majority of early human fossils. Is that because humans actually evolved there? Or is it just where conditions were perfect for fossilization? Could there be entire chapters of human evolution happening elsewhere, in regions where fossilization was less likely? The bones don't lie, but they don't tell the whole truth either. They show us moments, snapshots across millions of years, Lucy walking across Ethiopia, unknown individuals leaving footprints at Litoli, early humans napping stone tools at Olduvai. Each fossil is a miracle of preservation, a message from ancestors so distant they barely seem real. But between those moments, darkness, mystery, the long centuries where most of the story happened, unrecorded and probably unrecoverable. We have the outline now. We know humans began in Africa. We know we evolved from ape-like ancestors over millions of years. We know the general trajectory. The details, though, the actual experience of being those transitional creatures, living in that specific time and place, making that leap from animal to human, that story is still largely hidden, still waiting in the earth, still calling to researchers with enough determination to search impossible places for impossible finds. And sometimes, just sometimes, the earth gives up another secret, another bone, another piece of the puzzle, another whisper from the deep past, reminding us where we came from and how far we've travelled since. Here's something that will keep you awake at night, even though this is supposed to help you sleep. Every person alive today, all 8 billion of us, can trace our maternal lineage back to a single woman who lived in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. Scientists call her mitochondrial Eve. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time. That's important to understand. There were thousands, probably tens of thousands of other women walking around Africa when she lived. But somehow, through the randomness of reproduction, disease, disaster, and pure chance, every single one of their maternal lineages eventually died out. Only Eve's descendants kept having daughters who had daughters who had daughters, in an unbroken chain stretching from that ancient African landscape to you sitting here right now. The reason we can trace this lineage so precisely is because of mitochondrial DNA. Unlike the nuclear DNA you inherit from both parents, mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child. It doesn't recombine or shuffle, it just copies itself, generation after generation, accumulating tiny mutations at a predictable rate. These mutations act like a molecular clock. Count the differences between any two people's mitochondrial DNA, and you can estimate how long ago their maternal lineages diverged. When geneticists did this analysis across populations worldwide, something remarkable emerged. All the branches of humanity's maternal family tree converged on a single point. One woman, one location, Africa, around 200,000 years ago. But the story gets stranger. There's also a Y-chromosomal Adam, the most recent common male ancestor of all living humans. He lived in Africa too, but here's the weird part. He lived somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. So Adam and Eve weren't necessarily alive at the same time. They might have been separated by tens of thousands of years. This isn't a contradiction, it's just how population genetics works. The maternal and paternal lineages don't have to converge at the same point. They trace different patterns through history, responding to different evolutionary pressures. Men and women had different reproductive dynamics, different chances of passing on their genes to the next generation. What this really tells us is that modern human genetic diversity is incredibly recent. Shockingly recent. If you compare the genetic variation among all humans worldwide to the genetic variation found within a single population of chimpanzees in one forest in West Africa, the chimps are more diverse than we are. Think about that. You could take a random sample of chimpanzees from a 50-mile radius in Tanzania, and they would show more genetic differences than all of humanity combined, from the Arctic to the Amazon, from Tokyo to Tasmania. We're all basically cousins. Very, very close cousins. And the genetic diversity we do have, most of it is in Africa. The San people of southern Africa show more genetic variation within their own populations than exists between Europeans and Asians combined. Indigenous African groups separated by just a few hundred miles can be more genetically different from each other than a Norwegian is from a Chinese person. This isn't just interesting trivia, it's powerful evidence. Genetic diversity accumulates over time. Populations that have existed longer in one place have more time to develop genetic differences. The fact that African populations have the most diversity means they've been there the longest, by a lot. But then there's the bottleneck. That same genetic evidence that traces us all back to Africa also reveals something terrifying. Somewhere between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago, human population numbers crashed to almost nothing. Different studies give different estimates, but they're all horrifying. Some suggest the breeding population dropped to around 1,280 individuals. Others estimate as few as 18,500. Either way, our species was balanced on the edge of extinction for over 100,000 years. This wasn't just a bad decade or a rough century. This was 117,000 years of humanity hanging on by its fingernails. One really bad drought, one massive disease outbreak, one unfortunate series of events, and humans would have vanished forever. Everything that came after, all of civilization, all of art and science and philosophy, would never have existed. The genetic signature of this bottleneck is written into every cell in your body. We all carry the scars. Humans have remarkably low genetic diversity compared to other species, and that bottleneck is why. When population numbers crash that dramatically, genetic variation gets squeezed through the narrowest possible filter. Only the genes carried by those few thousand survivors made it through. Everything else was lost. Entire lineages, genetic variants that might have been useful, potential evolutionary paths we'll never explore. All gone because the population was too small to preserve them. But here's where the genetic map starts revealing things that don't fit neatly into textbooks. Ghost populations. Geneticists have found DNA sequences in modern African populations that don't match anything we know. They're human, definitely human, but they're not from any recognized human species. The sequences suggest these mystery humans diverged from our lineage over 1 million years ago, then interbred with our ancestors sometime in the last few 100,000 years. The problem? We have no fossils, no archaeological evidence, no physical proof these people existed at all. Just their DNA lingering like fingerprints at a crime scene where the body has vanished. Some of these ghost populations seem to have been deeply divergent, more different from modern humans than Neanderthals or Denisovans. Genetic analysis suggests they might have split from our lineage before we even left Africa, then survived in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years before encountering our ancestors again. When modern humans finally met them, there was interbreeding. enough to leave traces in the DNA of certain African populations today. But then these ghost humans disappeared completely from the fossil record and from history. Were they wiped out? Did they get absorbed into the expanding modern human population? We don't know, and there are multiple ghost populations, not just one mystery species, but several. Different studies keep finding unexplained genetic signals, ancient DNA sequences that don't match any known human fossils. It's like discovering footprints in your house from people you never invited, wearing shoes that don't match any style ever manufactured. The evidence is undeniable, but the explanation remains frustratingly out of reach. Then there are the anomalies that don't fit the standard narrative at all. Certain genetic markers that should have disappeared during the bottleneck but somehow survived. Population movements that happened far earlier than the fossil record suggests. Interbreeding events between groups that supposedly never met. The more we sequence ancient DNA, the more complicated the picture becomes. The simple story we learned in school about humans evolving in Africa, staying put for hundreds of thousands of years, then suddenly expanding outwards 60,000 years ago, that story's crumbling. The genetic evidence suggests something messier, more complex. Multiple expansions out of Africa, some of which failed. Back migrations bringing populations and genes back into Africa from Eurasia. Constant mixing and separating and remixing across hundreds of thousands of years. Ghost populations appearing and vanishing. Mystery humans leaving their mark in our DNA without leaving a single bone for us to study. We are living libraries. Every person carries in their cells the record of an incredibly complex and still partially hidden history. A history written in sequences of molecules too small to see, but too important to ignore. The genetic map keeps expanding, keeps revealing new mysteries, and the more we read it, the more questions emerge. Who were these ghost populations? Where did they live? What happened to them? And what else is hiding in our DNA waiting to be discovered, ready to rewrite everything we thought we knew about where we came from? So we know humanity began in Africa. We know the genetic evidence points there. The fossil record confirms it, and every human population outside Africa can trace their lineage back to migrants who left the continent relatively recently. But here's the question nobody really stops to ask. Why Africa? What made this one continent out of all the land masses on Earth the perfect place for human evolution? Was it just random chance? Or was there something special about Africa that practically guaranteed it would become the cradle of humanity? The answer is both simpler and more complex than you might think. Africa wasn't just a good place for human evolution. It was an evolutionary laboratory unlike anywhere else on the planet, a place where geography, geology, and climate came together to create the most perfect conditions imaginable for forcing apes to become something more. Start with the geography. Right down the eastern side of Africa, running from Ethiopia all the way south to Mozambique, there's a geological feature that changed everything, the Great Rift Valley. This isn't just some pretty landscape feature, it's one of the most geologically active regions on Earth, a place where the African continental plate is literally tearing itself apart. Slowly, just a few millimeters per year, but relentlessly. Around 25 million years ago, this rifting process began creating something unprecedented. A long chain of valleys, mountains, volcanoes, and lakes stretching thousands of miles. But here's what made it special for human evolution. The Rift Valley didn't create a uniform environment. It created thousands of different microenvironments, all packed together in close proximity. Walk 20 miles and you'd go from dense forest to open woodland to grassland to lakeside wetlands. Climb a mountain and you'd pass through half a dozen distinct ecological zones. This diversity was staggering, and it created evolutionary pressure unlike anything else on Earth. Think about it. If you're an ape living in a stable rainforest, Natural selection favors traits that make you better at living in rainforests. You specialize. Your descendants become increasingly adapted to that one environment, and they stay there because that's where they're most successful. But put those same apes in an environment that keeps changing, that offers dozens of different ecological niches within walking distance, and suddenly specialization becomes a trap. The apes that do best aren't the ones perfectly adapted to one environment. They're the ones flexible enough to exploit many environments. The generalists, the innovators, the ones smart enough to figure out new strategies when conditions change. That's exactly what the Rift Valley provided, a landscape so diverse that it rewarded behavioral flexibility over physical specialization. Our ancestors couldn't just develop longer arms for better tree climbing or specialized teeth for eating particular plants. The environment kept shifting too much. Instead, natural selection favored bigger brains, better problem-solving ability, the capacity to learn new behaviors quickly and pass them on to offspring. Scientists call this the mosaic landscape theory, and it explains so much about why humans evolved the way we did. We didn't evolve in one environment. We evolved in a constantly shifting patchwork of environments, each demanding different survival strategies. This forced our ancestors to become the ultimate generalists, capable of eating almost anything, living almost anywhere, adapting to almost any challenge through behavioral innovation rather than physical change. But the Rift Valley did more than just create diverse landscapes. It created barriers. As the valley floor sank and mountains rose, populations that had once been connected became isolated. Forest apes on one side of the valley couldn't easily reach forest apes on the other side because there were miles of open grassland between them. This geographic isolation is crucial for speciation. You need populations to be separated long enough to evolve distinct traits, but not so separated that they never exchange genes again. The Rift Valley provided exactly that balance. Populations separated for thousands of years, evolving independently, then reconnecting briefly when climate shifts created temporary bridges between their territories. Then there's the climate. Africa during the period of human evolution wasn't stable, it was chaotic. The planet was cycling through ice ages and warm periods, and Africa felt every shift. When northern ice sheets expanded, Africa dried out. Forests shrank, grasslands expanded, and our ancestors had to adapt or die. When ice sheets melted, rainfall increased, forest returned, and the challenges shifted again. These weren't minor fluctuations. They were dramatic swings between wet and dry periods, happening every few thousand years. Each climate shift acted like a filter, selecting for individuals who could adapt quickly, who could change their behavior, their diet, their tool use, their social organization in response to changing conditions. The ancient lakes of the Rift Valley were particularly important. Lake Turkana, Lake Malawi, Lake Tanganyika. These weren't just water sources, they were resource hotspots that stayed relatively stable even when surrounding areas dried out. During droughts, they became refuges where early humans could survive when populations elsewhere went extinct. The lakes provided fish, waterfowl, crocodiles, hippos. Shorelines attracted herbivores coming to drink, which meant hunting opportunities. Wetlands around the lakes offered edible plants, shellfish, turtle eggs. It was a buffet of resources that required different hunting and gathering strategies than the surrounding savanna. Living near these lakes forced cognitive flexibility. You couldn't just be a good hunter or a good plant gatherer. You had to be good at exploiting whatever resource was available at any given time. Some researchers have taken this water connection even further with what's called the aquatic ape hypothesis. Now this is controversial and most mainstream scientists are skeptical, but it's worth considering. The idea suggests that at some point in our evolution, our ancestors spent significant time in and around water, possibly in coastal or lakeside environments. Proponents point to unusual human traits that are rare among land mammals, but common in aquatic species. Our relative hairlessness, our subcutaneous fat layer, our ability to consciously control breathing, even our bipedalism, which could have started as wading behavior. Most anthropologists think these features evolved for other reasons. Loss of body hair for better heat dissipation while running, fat storage for surviving droughts, breath control for sustained running, and eventually for speech. But here's what's interesting. The debate itself highlights something important. Our ancestors did spend a lot of time near water. The archaeological evidence is clear on that. Whether they were wading, swimming, or just exploiting shoreline resources intensively, water was central to early human survival. And Africa had more of these water-based environments, especially during climate fluctuations, than anywhere else. There's also evidence for coastal migration routes along Africa's shores. When sea levels dropped during ice ages, new coastlines appeared, and early humans followed them, exploiting tidal pools, collecting shellfish, maybe even fishing. These coastal populations might have developed unique adaptations and behaviors that later spread inland. It's another example of how Africa's geography created opportunities for evolutionary innovation that simply didn't exist elsewhere. But here's what really sets Africa apart from other continents. It was the only place where all these factors came together at exactly the right time. Yes, Asia had diverse landscapes. Yes, Europe had climate fluctuations. Yes, other continents had lakes and rivers and coastlines. But only Africa had the specific combination of Rift Valley geography, extreme climate variability, diverse microenvironments in close proximity, and ancient lake systems, all during the precise window when ape brains were large enough to take advantage of these conditions but not so specialized that they couldn't adapt. It was a perfect storm, the geological forces of the Rift Valley creating the landscape, the climate cycles providing the pressure, the lakes and rivers offering the resources, all happening in the one place where our ape ancestors were already living, already on the edge of something extraordinary. Change one variable and maybe human evolution never happens. Put the Rift Valley somewhere else, or give Africa a stable climate, or remove those ancient lakes, and maybe we'd still be tree-dwelling apes wondering what might have been. But it all came together. Africa became not just the birthplace of humanity, but the only place it could have happened. An evolutionary laboratory that ran an experiment lasting millions of years, testing countless variations, selecting relentlessly for intelligence, adaptability, and behavioral flexibility. And the results of that experiment? They're still walking around today. 7 billion descendants of African apes, living on every continent, in every environment imaginable, all because one landmass had exactly the right conditions to turn possibility into reality. Here's the thing nobody tells you in school. When we talk about ancient civilizations, we hear about Sumer and Egypt, Greece and Rome. We're taught that civilization began around 5,000 years ago in the Middle East, that before that, humans were essentially primitive, hunter-gatherers with simple tools and simpler minds, just trying to survive. But that story, the one in all the textbooks, it's not just incomplete, it's fundamentally wrong. Because while the world was focused on pyramids and ziggurats, archaeologists were uncovering something far older, far stranger, in the caves and mountains of Africa. Evidence that humans were doing things we thought impossible tens of thousands of years before they were supposed to be capable of such achievements. Let's start with Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa. 1991. Archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood begins excavating what he thinks will be a typical Stone Age site. Maybe some basic tools, some animal bones, standard stuff. What he finds instead changes everything we thought we knew about human cognitive evolution. Inside layers of sediment dating back 100,000 years, his team discovers something that shouldn't exist. Pieces of ochre, that reddish mineral ancient humans sometimes used. But these pieces aren't just rocks. They're engraved, deliberately marked with geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines forming complex designs. This isn't accidental wear. This isn't random scratching. This is symbolic representation. This is art. Think about what that means. 100,000 years ago, humans in Africa were creating abstract patterns. They were thinking symbolically, representing ideas visually, engaging in behavior that we thought didn't emerge until maybe 40,000 years ago in Europe. We'd built our entire timeline of human cognitive development around the idea that symbolic thinking was recent, that it emerged suddenly in Europe during the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. But here was proof that Africans were doing it 60,000 years earlier, and it gets better, or stranger, depending on how attached you were to the old timeline. In the same cave they found beads, tiny shells with carefully drilled holes, strung together to make jewellery or decorative items, 75,000 years old. Someone spent time, considerable time, creating something that had no survival value, something purely decorative, purely symbolic. They were making statements about identity, status, belonging. They were being human in ways we thought primitive humans couldn't be. Then they found the workshop, actual evidence of ochre processing, abalone shells containing residue of what appears to be paint, ground ochre mixed with bone marrow and charcoal. Someone 100,000 years ago was mixing a compound paint, storing it in shells, probably using it for body decoration or rock art. This isn't just random ochre use. This is chemistry. This is planning. This is technology. But Blombos wasn't a fluke. Similar discoveries started emerging from sites across Africa. Border Cave, Deep Kloof Rock Shelter, Pinnacle Point, all showing sophisticated behavior dating back 70,000, 80,000, even 100,000 years. The evidence became overwhelming. Modern human behavior, the stuff that supposedly made us special, it didn't emerge recently. It had been there all along in Africa, hidden in plain sight because nobody thought to look that far back. Now let's talk about something even more controversial. Ancient mining. Wenya mine in Swaziland, now known as Eswatini. Modern miners working iron deposits in the 1960s kept hitting ancient tunnels. Not natural caves, tunnels. Deliberately excavated passages following mineral veins. They brought in archaeologists who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The tunnels weren't hundreds of years old. They weren't thousands of years old. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal from the ancient mining operations gave dates of 43,000 years. Let that sink in. 43,000 years ago, people in southern Africa were conducting organised mining operations. They were excavating hematite, an iron oxide ore, probably for use as pigment. But the sophistication is staggering. This wasn't just digging at surface deposits. These were systematic extraction operations, multiple tunnels following the richest veins, evidence of fire-setting techniques to crack rock, stone tools specifically designed for mining operations. The implications are profound. Mining requires planning, organisation, probably specialised labour. It requires a society complex enough to support people who weren't directly producing food. It requires knowledge transmission across generations because these operations continue for thousands of years. This is the infrastructure of civilization, appearing tens of thousands of years before civilization was supposed to exist. And it's not just Ngwenya. Ancient mining sites have been discovered across Africa. The Bomvu Ridge Hematite Mine, also in Swaziland, dates to 28,000 years ago. The Twin Rivers site in Zambia shows evidence of pigment mining dating back 400,000 years, though the early dates are more controversial. Either way, Africans were engaging in sophisticated resource extraction for unfathomable periods of time. But maybe the most mysterious discoveries are the structures. Scattered across the African continent are megalithic sites that don't fit our timeline. that challenge everything we think we know about when humans became builders, Adam's calendar in South Africa. A circular stone arrangement discovered in 2003 by pilot Johan Heine while flying over the Mpumalanga region. From the air, it's clearly artificial. Massive stone blocks arranged in a circle aligned with cardinal directions. The stones track the movement of the sun, marking solstices and equinoxes. It's basically a prehistoric observatory. Local legends called it the birthplace of the sun. Archaeoastronomers studying the site claim the alignments could date it to 75,000 years ago, though this remains intensely debated. Most mainstream archaeologists are more cautious, suggesting it might be only a few thousand years old. But even if the conservative dates are correct, that's still thousands of years before humans were supposed to be building such structures in southern Africa. And it's not alone. Across Africa there are hundreds, maybe thousands of stone structures that predate known civilizations. Stone circles in Senegambia, the megalithic structures of the Central African Republic, the mysterious ruins scattered across southern Africa that most archaeologists don't even know what to do with. Some show sophisticated astronomical alignments. Others seem to mark ancient trade routes or territorial boundaries. Many remain completely unstudied, ignored, because they don't fit the established narrative. Then there are the oral traditions, the stories that African peoples have maintained for thousands of years, passed down through generations, stories of ancient times, of great cities, of knowledge that was lost. Western academics often dismiss these as mythology, as primitive folklore. But increasingly, we're realizing that oral traditions can preserve historical information with remarkable accuracy across vast periods of time. Aboriginal Australians maintained oral traditions describing rising sea levels that occurred 10,000 years ago. Their stories align precisely with geological evidence. Why would African oral traditions be less reliable? Many African people speak of ancient civilizations, of times when their ancestors possessed knowledge that was later forgotten. Are these just myths? Or are they fragmentary memories of real events, real accomplishments that occurred so far back we've lost the archaeological evidence? The Dogon people of Mali have astronomical knowledge they claim was passed down from ancient times, knowledge about the star Sirius that seems impossibly detailed for a pre-telescopic culture. Mainstream science struggles to explain how they knew things they shouldn't have been able to know. The most common explanation is contamination from modern sources. But what if the knowledge really is ancient? What if it's a remnant of something older, something we've forgotten? Here's what makes all of this so frustrating. These discoveries exist. The evidence is there. The papers have been published in peer-reviewed journals. But somehow, it hasn't penetrated public consciousness. Ask most people when humans became behaviorally modern, and they'll say maybe 40,000 years ago. Ask them about ancient mining operations, and you'll get blank stares. The discoveries in Africa remain largely unknown outside specialist circles. Why? Maybe because they're not dramatic enough. No massive pyramids, no sprawling cities, just caves and tools and stones. Maybe because they challenge deeply ingrained assumptions about the progression of human civilization. Or maybe, and this is the uncomfortable possibility, because acknowledging Africa's depth of human achievement requires confronting biases about which populations were capable of what and when. What we're seeing as we peer deeper into Africa's past is evidence of minds just as capable as ours, just as creative, just as innovative, operating tens of thousands of years earlier than we thought possible, creating art, mining minerals, possibly building structures, passing down knowledge through generations. They weren't waiting for civilization to arrive from somewhere else. They were creating the foundations of everything that would come after. And we're only beginning to understand what they accomplished. Because for every site that's been excavated, hundreds remain untouched. For every discovery that's been published, countless others sit in storage, unstudied and unknown. The story of Africa before history is still being written, still emerging from the earth, one artifact at a time. What else is out there, waiting to be found? By the time your ancestors had become fully modern humans in Africa, they weren't just surviving anymore. They were experimenting, testing boundaries, pushing into new environments, then pulling back when things went wrong. The continent that had forged them was still their home, still full of danger and opportunity. But for some groups, Africa was starting to feel crowded. Not crowded the way we think of it now. There were no cities, no villages, not even permanent camps. But as numbers grew, territories began to overlap. Hunting grounds that had once supported a single band were now being shared by 2 or 3. Rivers that had always been reliable started to run low in bad years. Familiar waterholes had more footprints around them. Animal herds shifted their routes. The balance between people and resources grew delicate again. And humans, these new, restless, hyper-adaptable humans, did what they had always done when pressure built up. They moved. We usually talk about the out-of-Africa migration as if it were a single heroic journey. One great exodus, one bold group of explorers marching off into the unknown. The reality was messier, slower, and much more interesting. It wasn't one migration, it was waves, pulses, a heartbeat of movement in and out of Africa, echoing across more than 100,000 years. The first pulses may have started as early as 200,000 years ago. Small groups leaving northeast Africa, crossing the Sinai, or skirting the Red Sea coast into what is now the Middle East. We know this not because they left clear footprints, but because tiny fragments of their DNA linger in unexpected places, and a few scattered fossils hint that modern-like humans were in the Levant long before the famous Exodus 60,000 years ago. But these early journeys were fragile. Climate could shift in a single lifetime. A corridor that was green one generation might be desert the next. Rivers dried, grasslands vanished, animal routes changed. The archaeological record shows hints of humans outside Africa at these early dates, and then silence. No continuity, no large populations, no living descendants we can trace clearly. It's as if the world gave permission to leave, and then slammed the door shut again. These were the failed expansions, brave or desperate groups pushing out into Eurasia, only to be erased by droughts, ice advances, competition with Neanderthals, or simple bad luck. Whole lineages might have disappeared without leaving a single survivor. Their tools ground down to dust, their bones dissolved, their stories never told. But each failed attempt taught something. Even if those specific groups vanished, their close relatives back in Africa were experimenting too, watching the climate, following herds, learning which routes might be passable in wet years, which coastlines stayed productive when inland grasslands failed. Over tens of thousands of years, a pattern emerged. A path. This is where the coastal route theory comes in. Imagine standing on the eastern shore of Africa, near the Red Sea, around 70,000 years ago. Behind you, shifting savannas, forests and deserts, unpredictable rains, competing bands. Ahead of you, a narrow stretch of water, and beyond it, a ribbon of coastline stretching thousands of miles. Mangroves, tidal pools, beaches, estuaries, a continuous conveyor belt of food, shellfish, crabs, small fish trapped in tidal pools, seabirds and their eggs, edible seaweeds. Coastal environments are some of the richest on Earth, and they're surprisingly stable compared to the interior. The tide always comes back. The ocean doesn't have droughts in the same way land does. Some researchers think your ancestors figured this out and made a radical choice. Instead of chasing herds across the interior, they hugged the shorelines. Group by group, generation by generation, they may have followed the coasts out of Africa, skirting along the southern edge of Arabia, then eastward along the shores of India, Southeast Asia, and eventually down to what is now Indonesia and Australia. If this is right, the first global explorers weren't trudging across frozen plains. They were beachcombers. Picture it. Children playing in the surf while adults gather shellfish, mend nets, sharpen stone blades. Fires glowing against the dark sea at night. The sound of waves mixing with human voices, with stories passed down about places farther along the coast where the shell beds are thicker, where the cliffs offer better shelter, where the storms are less fierce. This coastal route theory helps explain something that used to be a mystery, how humans appear in Australia by at least 65,000 years ago. That's astonishingly early. To get there, they had to cross open water, plan for journeys they couldn't see the end of, and carry enough knowledge and technology to survive on islands and unfamiliar shores. But not every group followed the ocean. Some stayed in Africa by choice or necessity. For them, the continent was still a vast mosaic of possibilities. The Sahara wasn't always a desert. In some periods, it was a green corridor full of lakes and rivers, a gigantic seasonal highway connecting West, East, and North Africa. Forests pulsed in and out with the climate. Mountains offered refuges. Lakes swelled and shrank. For many bands, moving within Africa was easier, safer, and more familiar than crossing into unknown continents. Other groups left and then, in a twist that rarely makes it into popular stories, came back. Genetic studies suggest multiple back migrations into Africa. Populations that had moved into the Middle East or beyond at one time later flowed back south, re-entering the continent and mixing with the people who had stayed. These returning groups brought with them new genetic variants, new tool styles, possibly new diseases and new ideas. Africa wasn't just the starting point, it was also a crossroads, a place where outgoing and incoming streams of humanity met, blended and diverged again. When we picture migration, we often imagine one-way arrows on a map. The reality looked more like tangled roots and branches weaving in and out of the continent, over and over. So why did some bands decide to leave at all? Part of it was simple population pressure. When numbers rise and resources stay the same, there are only a few options: fight, innovate, or move. Our ancestors clearly did all three at different times, but movement was often the least risky. Better to walk over the next ridge and see what's there than to start a war that might wipe out half your group. Climate played its part too. Shifting monsoons, changing sea levels, expanding and contracting deserts. All of these created windows of opportunity. In wet periods, corridors opened, green belts connecting Africa to Eurasia. In dry phases, those same corridors closed and populations were pushed into refuges or driven along new routes. But there was something else, something harder to measure: curiosity. By the time of the Great Migrations, humans weren't just clever animals reacting to the environment. They were storytellers. They could imagine places they hadn't seen. They could dream about lands where the game was plentiful, where the rivers ran clear and cold, where no other bands had claimed the best spots. Somewhere in your ancestry, a small group stood at the edge of familiar territory, listened to these stories and said, "Let's see." From a genetic standpoint, the group that finally succeeded in leaving Africa around 60 to 70,000 years ago and spreading widely was small. Maybe just a few thousand breeding individuals at most, possibly less. A sliver of the total African population at the time. Yet over tens of thousands of years their descendants would come to inhabit almost every corner of the planet. How does a tiny founding population become 8 billion people? Slowly at first. Human numbers stayed low for a long time. Life was still dangerous. Infant mortality was high. Accidents, infections, and famines were constant threats. A slight tilt in climate, a volcanic eruption, a new disease, Any of these could have snuffed out entire branches of your family tree. But humans had an advantage no other animal on Earth could match: cultural inheritance. Each generation didn't have to start from zero. They inherited fire-making techniques, hunting strategies, foraging knowledge, tool designs, navigation tricks, medicinal plant lore. They were born into a growing library of survival information stored in stories, rituals, and daily habits. As people spread into Eurasia, Australia, the Americas, and remote Pacific islands, that library expanded in every direction. Snow shelters and tailored clothing for Arctic winters, desert water finding techniques, boat-building traditions for crossing open ocean, agricultural knowledge that let small groups settle and grow into villages, then towns, then cities. Slow, fragile growth eventually reached a tipping point. Farming made food more predictable. Surpluses supported more children. Populations expanded, sometimes explosively. In just the last few thousand years, a blink of an eye compared to the 117,000-year bottleneck, human numbers went from millions to billions. Some researchers have wondered whether Africa was the only cradle of modern humans, or just the primary one. Were there multiple origin points? Did modern humans evolve in several regions at once and then blend together? A strict multi-regional model doesn't fit the genetic evidence well. Our deepest genetic roots are unmistakably African, and the highest genetic diversity on Earth is still found within Africa, a hallmark of a long, continuous presence. But the story isn't simple, single origin either. There were back migrations into Africa, as we've seen. There were encounters and interbreeding with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other, still unknown human forms. There may have been archaic populations within Africa itself that mixed with early modern humans, adding their own threads to the tapestry. So instead of a single cradle or many independent cradles, it might be closer to imagine a network of nurseries, Africa as the main one, rich and ancient, with others briefly flickering into existence outside it, feeding back in, blending, reshaping, a dynamic, swirling system rather than a straight line. When you look around at 8 billion people today, different languages, cultures, skin tones, histories, it's easy to forget how improbable all of this is. Our global presence rests on a razor-thin chain of survival decisions. A band that chose to follow a coastline instead of turning inland, a family that crossed a narrow strait in a small boat, a group that kept walking when others stayed put. Every step away from Africa carried risk, but it also carried memory. The memory of a continent that had forged our species in fire and famine and fragile cooperation. Even as humans left, they carried Africa with them, in their genes, in their stories, in the very shape of their minds. Humanity left home. But home never really left humanity. By the time our African ancestors were spreading out after the bottleneck, they weren't stepping into an empty world. Africa wasn't just the cradle of our species, it was a crowded nursery of cousins, other kinds of humans who walked upright, made tools, raised children, and looked out over the same savannas with eyes not so different from yours. For most of the 20th century, scientists imagined human evolution like a ladder, one species replacing another in neat, orderly steps. But Africa refuses to fit that story. The fossils, the genetics, the archaeology, together they paint a very different picture. Not a ladder, but a tangled forest of branches. Species overlapping, coexisting, sometimes competing, sometimes sharing more than just territory. One of the strangest of these branches was discovered deep underground in a cave system called Rising Star in South Africa, Homo naledi. When its bones were first found, scientists were confused. The skeletons looked like something out of a time warp. The hands and feet were human-like, capable of precise grip and upright walking. But the shoulders and ribcage were more primitive, almost ape-like, and the brain was tiny, about a third the size of yours, closer to a chimpanzee than a modern human. For years nobody knew how old they were. Some thought they must be ancient, maybe over 1 million years old. A small-brained side branch that vanished long before Homo sapiens appeared. Then came the date, around 230,000 to 330,000 years ago. That puts Homo naledi living in Africa at the same time as early modern humans, not as distant ancestors, but as neighbours. Another human species walking the continent while our own was still taking shape. And the real shock wasn't just when they lived, it was what they seemed to be doing. The Rising Star Cave isn't an easy place to reach. To get to the chamber where the bones were found, you have to squeeze through tight passages, crawl through darkness, descend steep, narrow shafts. It's not the kind of place an animal just wanders into and dies. Yet in that chamber, researchers found the remains of at least 15 individuals, from infants to elderly adults. Almost no other bones. No signs of predators dragging corpses in. No evidence of a natural trap. It looks incredibly like deliberate body disposal. A small-brained human, barely the height of a 5th grader, may have been carrying its dead deep into the earth. On purpose. Not once, but repeatedly, over time. Some researchers argue this is too sophisticated, that we must be missing something. Others point to the distribution of bones, the lack of animal marks, the repeated pattern, and say no, this is ritual, this is symbolic behaviour, this is a species with traditions. If that's true, Homo naledi forces us to rethink what we thought we knew about intelligence. Maybe you don't need a giant brain to grieve, to remember, to care for the dead, and Homo naledi was just one of many. Across Africa, fossils tell us that for hundreds of thousands of years, multiple human species overlapped. In East Africa, you find remains of Homo heidelbergensis, a robust, powerful human, thought to be an ancestor of both Neanderthals and us. In North Africa, you find the so-called Jebel Irhoud people, early Homo sapiens with a mix of modern and archaic traits. In West and Central Africa, the record is thinner, but stone tools and scattered bones hint at other populations, other experiments in being human. For millennia, these groups weren't separated neatly by species borders. They were neighbours. They may have met at waterholes, followed the same herds, watched the same storms roll across the sky. And sometimes they may have shared more than glances. Genetic studies of living Africans show something surprising. Deep in the DNA of some populations are traces of genes that don't match any known fossil species, variants that split from our lineage long before Neanderthals or Denisovans, yet somehow found their way into modern genomes. Scientists call these ghost lineages, human relatives we haven't yet found in the ground, but whose DNA still whispers from within our cells. One analysis suggests that some West and Central African groups carry up to 2 to 19% of their ancestry from these unknown humans, not Neanderthals, not Denisovans, something else. A population, or maybe several, that lived and interbred with early Homo sapiens in Africa, then vanished physically while leaving a genetic shadow. The picture that emerges is not one of clean separations, but of blending. Hybrid populations. Children with mothers of one species and fathers of another. Genes crossing species boundaries like travellers on ancient trade routes. And yet, today, only one human species remains. Us. All the others, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis, Homo heidelbergensis and more, are gone. Their bones lie silent in caves and riverbeds. Their genes survive only as fragments inside us. Why? Did they simply fade away, victims of changing climate, shrinking habitats and bad luck? Or did our ancestors play a more direct role? Some researchers argue that the disappearance of other humans lines up suspiciously well with the spread of Homo sapiens. In Europe, Neanderthals vanish within a few thousand years of modern humans arriving. In parts of Asia, Denisovan traces become rare after Homo sapiens shows up. In Africa, archaic populations seem to decline as our species becomes more widespread. Coincidence? Maybe. But evolution is rarely gentle. When two closely related species share the same ecological niche, competition can be brutal. Better tools, more flexible social systems, more efficient hunting strategies, small advantages can snowball over generations. If our ancestors outcompeted other humans for food, territory and mates, the result wouldn't necessarily look like dramatic battles. It might look like something quieter, more unsettling. Fewer children born to other species, more born to ours. Over time, their numbers dwindle. Some groups die out. Others are absorbed, their genes diluted into ours. Eventually, the separate species vanish, leaving only a handful of genetic markers as proof they ever existed. There are more ominous possibilities too. Evidence of trauma on some Neanderthal bones, burned butchered remains at certain sites. It's possible, maybe even likely, that conflict sometimes turned violent, that humans killed other humans not just for food or territory, but because they were different. But here, the record goes dark. Archaeology shows patterns. Genetics reveals traces. Neither can tell us what it felt like. Were there alliances between species, shared rituals, friendships, love? Imagine a child born to a Homo sapiens mother and a father from a ghost lineage we haven't yet named. How did their band see them? As a bridge between worlds, or as something to be feared? We don't know. We may never know. What we can say is that our story is not one of pure isolation. We are not the only humans Africa made. We're simply the last ones left. When you look at your reflection, you're seeing more than just Homo sapiens. Behind your features, at the level of DNA, echoes of other faces linger. Neanderthal eyes, Denisovan lungs, ghost lineage immune system shaped by ancient African pathogens, genes that once helped some forgotten cousin survive in a forest or swamp now help you fight off disease without you ever knowing their origin. Even Homo naledi, tiny-brained and enigmatic, may have left some legacy, if not in our genes, then in our understanding of what being human can look like. They remind us that intelligence wears many shapes, that ritual, care for the dead, and social complexity might not be exclusive to big-brained moderns. And then there are the missing ones, the fossils we haven't found yet, the caves we haven't opened, the skeletons eroded away by time, the entire human species that lived, loved, raised children, and died under African skies, leaving almost nothing behind. Ghost lineages in the ground to match the ghost lineages in our genes. What really happened to our closest relatives? Were they pushed aside by climate and chance, or by our ancestors' relentless expansion? Did they vanish with a whisper or a scream? Tonight, as you lie in the dark, picture Africa not as a single-story cradle, but as a busy, bustling family home. Multiple human species sharing the same continent, sometimes the same valleys and rivers, some taller, some shorter, some more robust, some more delicate. Different faces, different skull shapes, different ways of thinking, all human in their own ways. For a brief moment in deep time they were all there together, and in a very real sense they're still here, in your blood, in your bones, in the quiet, persistent mystery of why only one branch of that great human forest survived to tell the story. By the time scientists finally accepted that humanity began in Africa, something strange had already happened to the story. The evidence was there in the rocks and the bones and the DNA. But the way the story was told, that was something else entirely. For centuries, Africa had been described in European writing as a place without history, a blank space, a backdrop, a continent where things happened to people, not a continent where people made things happen. That idea didn't come from the fossils. It didn't come from the genetics. It came from empire. As European powers carved Africa into colonies, they weren't just taking land and resources, they were also taking control of the narrative. And that meant anything that suggested deep African sophistication, ancient African science, or early African innovation was inconvenient, dangerous even. So a lot of it was quietly erased. Sometimes the erasure was literal, archaeological sites destroyed to build railways, forts, and plantations. Rock art blasted away for mining. Sacred groves, places where communities had preserved memories and rituals for generations, cut down and burned because they got in the way of development. Travel journals from the 1800s describe stone ruins in southern Africa that locals said were built by their ancestors. Within a few decades, European scholars were insisting that these same structures must have been built by people from somewhere else. Arabs, Phoenicians, even the mythical lost tribes of Israel, anyone but the Africans who actually lived there. This pattern repeated over and over. Impressive metalworking, must have been imported technology. Sophisticated astronomy, must have come from the Middle East. Complex trade routes and city planning, surely the influence of outsiders. The assumption wasn't based on evidence. It was based on a belief that Africa couldn't possibly be the starting point of human brilliance, only the starting point of human bodies, labour, resources, raw material. So even when early fossils began turning up in African soil, the story was bent to fit the bias. When skulls and bones from Europe or Asia looked advanced, they were hailed as milestones in human progress. When equally important remains were found in Africa, they were sometimes downplayed, misdated, or treated as curiosities. It took decades for the African fossil record to be seen not as a side note to human evolution, but as the main chapter. Some discoveries simply vanished into storage rooms and private collections. Early stone tools collected during colonial expeditions, labelled hastily, incorrectly, or not at all. Fossils taken out of Africa and never returned. Artifacts that could have filled in the gaps of our origin story, locked away where almost no one could study them. Others were reinterpreted to minimize their implications. If an African site showed signs of early symbolic behavior, beads, pigments, abstract carvings, some researchers were quick to argue that the ideas must have been introduced from elsewhere. If architecture, metallurgy, or navigation seemed too sophisticated for the prejudices of the time, theories sprouted about lost white civilizations, vanished foreign elites, mysterious outsiders who supposedly came, built everything, and then disappeared. It's not that there was no debate. Some archaeologists, African and non-African, pushed back hard against these narratives, even when it cost them careers. But for a long time, the loudest voices were the ones that fit neatly with colonial ideology, and the result was a global education system that treated Africa like the prologue to history, not the centre of it. Textbooks lingered on Greece and Rome, Mesopotamia and China, while African achievements were compressed into a few paragraphs, often framed as a peripheral. The fact that the earliest known members of our species came from Africa was mentioned briefly, then the focus shifted away, as if Africa's job was just to get humanity started and then step aside. Meanwhile, a quieter battle was taking place over the physical pieces of that story. Walk through museums in London, Paris, Berlin, or New York, and you'll see African artifacts everywhere. Masks, sculptures, tools, even human remains. Many of them were taken in ways that would now be considered theft. Some were seized during military campaigns. Others were collected from communities who were in no position to refuse. Among these objects are fossils and bones that are crucial to understanding human origins. Jaw fragments, skull pieces, ancient tools, items excavated in Africa, shipped to Europe, and never brought back. For decades, the idea of returning these materials, repatriation, was treated as unrealistic or sentimental, as if the real owners of African history were the institutions that held it, not the people whose ancestors lived it. That's starting to change. African universities, museums, and research centres are pushing for the return of fossils and artefacts. New labs are being built on the continent. New generations of African scientists are leading excavations, reanalyzing old collections and asking new questions that previous researchers never thought to ask. When fossils come home, they aren't just pieces of bone, they're keys. They unlock fresh investigations on African soil, using local knowledge of landscapes, oral histories, and sacred sites that were ignored before. They allow African scholars to shape the narrative of human origins from the ground up. And it's not just about bones and stones. Long before Western science accepted that humans began in Africa, many African cultures held stories that, in their own way, said something similar. Myths of people emerging from particular mountains, caves, or rivers, tales of long journeys, climate shifts, vanished animals, memories carried in song and ritual. To an outside observer, these might look like pure legend. But in the last few decades, some anthropologists and geneticists have started to notice curious overlaps. Stories about a time of great dryness, when people had to move closer to coasts or rivers, echo what paleoclimate data shows about ancient droughts. Traditions that link certain clans to specific lakes, escarpments, or highlands mirror what genetic studies reveal about old migration routes. Rituals tied to star patterns match documented observations of how some African communities tracked seasons with astonishing precision. Indigenous knowledge systems weren't written in books. They were encoded in ceremonies, in taboos, in the way elders taught children to read a landscape. Colonial officials often dismissed these systems as superstition and did everything they could to stamp them out, banning rituals, punishing pagan practices, forcing conversions, breaking the chains that linked memory across generations. But not everything was lost. In some places, stories survived underground, whispered instead of sung. In others, they blended with newer religions and political realities hiding in plain sight. Now, a few careful researchers are beginning to treat these knowledge systems not as quaint folklore, but as alternate archives of the human past. When you put the pieces together, the fossils, the genetics, the oral traditions, something subtle but important happens. The story of human origins becomes less about a single eureka moment in a European lab, and more about a slow, collective rediscovery of something people in Africa had, in some form, always known. That their land, their ancestors, their skies and rivers and caves were not peripheral to humanity, but central to it. And quietly, almost without fanfare, the evidence keeps piling up. New digs in Morocco, Ethiopia, Kenya and South Africa are pushing back the timeline for modern human traits. Finds that would once have been dismissed, early art, complex tools, long-distance trade, are now being taken seriously. Genetic studies are revealing that African populations hold more diversity than the rest of the world combined, as you'd expect from the continent where our species spent most of its history. Textbooks are being updated slowly. Museum labels are changing slowly. But there's still a gap between what specialists now understand and what most people are taught in school. You might hear that humans came from Africa in a sentence or two. What you probably won't hear is how long that fact was resisted, how many discoveries were sidelined, how many African scholars and communities were shut out of the conversation about their own origins. You won't often hear that our entire species spent tens of thousands of generations in Africa before anyone left, that every human alive today, from every country and every background, carries a genetic story written first in African genomes, that the knowledge systems of people long treated as primitive may hold clues to migrations and climate events science is only now beginning to confirm. These are the suppressed histories, the erased sites, the misattributed achievements, the ignored voices, the bones taken away and the stories taken with them. As those pieces slowly return, physically, intellectually and spiritually, the narrative of human origins is shifting, becoming less Eurocentric, less linear, less clean, more complex, more honest, and much more interesting. Because when you stop seeing Africa as the backdrop and start seeing it as the main stage, a different kind of question appears on the horizon. If so much of our shared past was hidden or distorted, what else might still be waiting in the dark, just beneath the sand or between the lines of an old story, ready to change everything we think we know again? The further back you go into this story, the more the light begins to fade, evidence thins out, bones grow rarer, tools become harder to interpret, and at a certain point you're not just following a clear trail anymore, you're feeling your way through the dark, guided by scattered clues and educated guesses. And that's where the real mysteries begin. Because for all we've learned about our African origins, there are questions we still can't answer. Questions that go beyond bones and DNA. Questions about what it felt like to be human before we were fully human. Think about consciousness for a moment. Not just being awake, not just reacting to the world, but that deep internal awareness you carry everywhere, the sense of I, the voice in your head that you're listening to right now. When did that appear? Your bottleneck ancestors had larger brains than their predecessors. They used fire, shared knowledge, cooperated with astonishing skill. They clearly weren't just clever animals. But were they self-aware in the way you are? Did they lie awake by the fire at night, staring at the stars, wondering where they came from? Did they feel awe or dread, or a sense of destiny? Or were those deeper layers of consciousness still forming, still being wired together by slow, relentless evolution? Science can tell us when skulls change shape, when brain volume increases, when tool technology shifts. But it can't tell us the exact moment a mind looks at its own reflection in water and recognizes itself. It can't pinpoint the first dream, the first abstract thought, the first time someone realized that they personally were going to die. Some researchers think true human-like consciousness emerged gradually as brain networks grew more complex and social life demanded more mental power. Others suggest it might have been more like a tipping point, a slow build-up of neural complexity, and then suddenly a threshold crossed. One generation of children seeing the world differently from their parents. We don't know. We may never know. All we can do is stand at the edge of that mystery and imagine, and consciousness isn't the only puzzle. Our evolutionary story is filled with strange jumps, long periods of slow change, then sudden leaps forward that are hard to explain. You can see one of these jumps in the archaeological record. For hundreds of thousands of years, human tools change, but not dramatically. Hand axes get a little sharper, flakes get a little more refined, hunting strategies improve. But then, in certain times and places, it's as if someone flips a switch. Suddenly you get advanced stone points, bone tools, fishing gear, pigments. The kind of toolkit that suggests not just survival, but creativity, planning, experimentation. It's the same with our bodies. The bottleneck compresses our genetic diversity, reshapes our brains, refines our social intelligence. Then, over the next few 100,000 years, modern human traits appear with unusual speed. A more delicate skeleton, a reorganized brain, a face that looks surprisingly like the ones you see in the mirror today. Most scientists think these leaps are still natural, the result of powerful selection pressures and small isolated populations where new traits can spread quickly. but there are gaps in the record. Whole phases of evolution we can only infer from a handful of fossils and fragments of DNA. Those gaps leave room for questions. Did we lose entire intermediate populations that would make the story smoother? Are there species we haven't even discovered yet, whose bones are still buried deep under African soil, or drowned beneath ancient shorelines that no longer exist? Then there's the greatest leap of all: language, art, and complex thought. At some point our ancestors stopped just surviving and started symbolizing, turning sounds into meaning, turning thoughts into images, turning experiences into stories that could outlive them. When did that start? We have hints. Engraved pieces of ochre from South Africa, scratched with deliberate geometric patterns more than 70,000 years ago. Shell beads stained with red pigment, probably used as personal ornaments. Caves in Africa with traces of paint long before the famous art of Europe. These aren't accidents. They're signs that someone, somewhere, was thinking symbolically, that they understood a line on a rock could stand for something, a mark, a memory, an identity. But language doesn't fossilize. We can't dig up a conversation. We'll never hear the first bedtime story told beside a fire on a cool African night. We'll never know the exact moment when a word stopped being just a sound and started being an idea you could share, reshape, and pass on. Some researchers argue that full language appeared very late, maybe within the last 100,000 years, and spread like an innovation from one group to many. Others believe it emerged slowly and in parallel across different populations, with grunts and gestures gradually becoming grammar and syntax. Either way, it's a mystery that sits at the heart of what makes us human. Without language, there is no history, no myth, no culture, just individuals living and dying. With language, there is story. And once story appears, everything changes. Complicating things even more are the oddities, the artifacts and sites that don't quite fit. In Africa and beyond, archaeologists sometimes uncover tools or remains that seem out of place. Stone points that look too advanced for their supposed age. Traces of early seafaring where we didn't expect it. Signs of organized activity in regions thought to be empty at that time. Most of these anomalies eventually find explanations. Dates get adjusted, contexts are reinterpreted. But a few stubborn puzzles remain. Did some groups achieve surprisingly advanced technology much earlier than we think, then vanish without leaving a clear trail of successors? Were there local bursts of innovation that burned bright and then faded, erased by climate change, disaster, or simply the passage of time? Then there's the biggest hidden canvas of all, the Sahara. Today, it's one of the harshest deserts on Earth, a vast, silent ocean of sand. But for long stretches of the past, the Sahara was green, not just slightly greener but alive. Lakes, rivers, grasslands, forests, animals roaming, people living, hunting, gathering, maybe even building. We found rock art on isolated plateaus, paintings of cattle, giraffes, swimmers in what must once have been deep, cool water. We've discovered hints of ancient lakes the size of small seas. But the desert sands still conceal almost everything. What lies beneath those dunes? Entire landscapes where early humans may have thrived for tens of thousands of years. Settlements, tools, perhaps early experiments in farming or pastoral life, all buried under meters of shifting sand. Chapters of our African story written in places we currently can't reach. As satellite technology improves, as ground-penetrating radar becomes more powerful, we're starting to glimpse traces. Old river channels, possible sites, patterns that don't look natural. The Sahara may yet reveal one of the greatest lost chapters of human history. But for now, it keeps its secrets. And that's the quiet truth behind all of this. For every mystery we solve, new ones appear. Every fossil raises fresh questions. Every genetic study clarifies one branch of the tree and blurs another. There are limits to what we can ever know. Bones decay, artifacts erode, whole landscapes drown beneath rising seas or dry up into desert. Oral traditions vanish when the last storyteller dies. We can reconstruct, model and imagine. We can compare DNA, measure skulls, map ancient climates. But we will never have a complete, perfectly detailed picture of how, where and why every step of our evolution happened. Some things will always remain in shadow, and maybe that's fitting. Because your story, the story of humanity, began in mystery, in a world where a handful of people huddled around fires in ancient African nights, looking out into the darkness, not knowing what tomorrow would bring. Tonight, you're doing something very similar, lying in the dim light, listening to fragments of a much larger tale, knowing that parts of it will always be beyond reach. But even if the full truth is forever hidden, one thing is clear. Whatever answers we're still missing, whatever chapters are still buried under desert sands or lost to time, they're all part of the same ancient thread. The thread that leads from those first African survivors all the way to you. So far we've been travelling backward. Bones, genes, bottlenecks, ancient fires in the dark. But the story of Africa isn't just buried in sediments or locked in chromosomes. It's still alive, still walking around, still breathing under the same stars your ancestors watched 100,000 years ago. If you want to see humanity's past and future at the same time, you don't need a time machine. You need to look at living Africans. Because here's something quietly astonishing. When geneticists map human diversity around the world, they keep finding the same pattern. Almost all the genetic variation on Earth is found inside Africa. Populations in Europe, Asia, the Americas, Oceania, they all carry just a subset of what already exists on the African continent. You can think of it like this. Imagine Africa as a vast ancient library filled with millions of books written over hundreds of thousands of years. When small groups of humans left Africa, they could only carry a backpack of books with them, just a tiny sample. As their descendants spread across the world, they kept copying and recopying those same few volumes, adding small edits here and there, but the original overflowing library stayed where it began. That library is African genetic diversity, and we're only starting to understand what's inside it. Hidden in that diversity are clues to why some people are more resistant to certain diseases, why some populations respond differently to medications, why some genetic variants seem to protect against conditions like heart disease or high-altitude sickness. Medical researchers are realizing that if we want to understand human health, your health, my health, the future of medicine, we have to pay attention to Africa. Genes that evolve to cope with tropical parasites, fluctuating climates, scarce food, or intense ultraviolet radiation are still shaping how bodies function today. Some of those adaptations helped people survive malaria. Others shaped how we process fats and sugars. Some might even affect how our brains develop and age. But for decades, most genetic studies focused on people of European descent. It's as if science tried to understand humanity by reading only one corner of one shelf in that enormous library. Now slowly the focus is shifting back. Large-scale sequencing projects in Africa are uncovering entirely new branches of the human family tree, new variations in immune system genes, new possibilities for treating disease. The continent that gave birth to our species may also hold the keys to curing some of our most stubborn illnesses. And it's not just in DNA. Africa's living legacy runs through culture, knowledge and ways of life that have survived for tens of thousands of years. In some parts of the continent, people still use survival techniques that would have looked completely familiar to your bottleneck-era ancestors. hunter-gatherer groups tracking animals across vast distances by reading faint disturbances in the soil, herders following ancient seasonal routes, knowing exactly when a landscape that looks dry and dead will suddenly bloom with hidden water and grazing, foragers who can walk through a patch of scrub that seems empty to outsiders and gather a full meal in minutes. Take the San people of southern Africa. For a long time they were called Bushmen by outsiders. Today many prefer San or their own community names. They live in regions that seem brutally harsh to most of us. Semi-deserts, savannas, landscapes of thorn and sand and sun. Genetic research suggests that the San carry some of the oldest, deepest branches of the human family tree. Their lineages split off from other human populations extraordinarily early, long before modern humans spread across the rest of the world. That doesn't make them primitive. It makes them living guardians of an ancient heritage. Watch a sand tracker at work and you're seeing something that bridges hundreds of thousands of years. Barefoot or in simple sandals, moving slowly, almost casually, they can follow a set of prints across hard ground where you might not even see a single footprint. A tiny change in the angle of a blade of grass, a scuff in the dust, a faint odour of crushed plant. The environment is speaking, and they know how to listen. Their knowledge isn't written down in textbooks. It's passed from elders to children through stories, apprenticeships, long walks, shared hunts. It's a continuation of the same obsessive teaching strategy your bottleneck ancestors evolved. Pass on everything, leave nothing important unsaid, because the cost of ignorance can be death. Some San communities still make fire with friction, craft bows and poisoned arrows, and use trance dances for healing and spiritual connection. When you watch them, you're not just seeing a traditional culture, you're seeing echoes of the social intelligence, cooperation, and symbolic thinking that kept tiny human bands alive in ancient Africa. And they're not alone. Across the continent, from Hadza, foragers in Tanzania, to forest peoples in Central Africa, indigenous groups preserve fragments of lifestyles that stretch back into deep time. Their songs, myths, and rituals often encode sophisticated ecological knowledge, where water can be found in the drier season, which plants heal, which should never be touched. While these ways of life are under immense pressure from modern states, climate change, and economic forces, they remain invaluable windows into how humans adapted to Africa's challenges in the first place. They're not frozen in the past, they evolve and change, but they carry threads that lead back to our shared beginning. And while these living traditions continue, the ground beneath their feet is still giving up secrets. Right now, as you listen, archaeologists are digging in caves, riverbeds, and ancient lake shores across Africa, finding things that rewrite chapters of human history every few years. In places like Morocco, Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya, and Tanzania, new fossils are pushing back the dates of when our species first appeared. Stone tools uncovered in unexpected layers are suggesting that sophisticated technologies arose earlier than we thought, or in regions we barely studied before. Cave sites reveal pigments, beads, and engravings that hint at symbolic behavior in Africa tens of thousands of years before similar evidence shows up in Europe. At one site, a carefully arranged collection of red ochre pieces engraved with cross-hatched patterns. At another, perforated shells stained with pigment, likely worn as ornaments. At yet another, the remains of complex fishing strategies and shoreline exploitation that show early humans were far more inventive and flexible than older theories allowed. Every new find forces researchers to ask uncomfortable questions. Were the first symbolic artists African hunter-gatherers sitting around a coastal camp tens of thousands of years before painted caves appeared in Europe? Did maritime technologies develop in Africa long before they showed up anywhere else? How many entire cultures rose and fell on African soil, leaving only the faintest archaeological traces we're just learning to recognize. We don't have all the answers yet. We may never have a complete picture, but each discovery pulls another thread, and almost every thread leads back to Africa as the central stage, not a distant prologue. So why does any of this matter for our future? Because remembering that we all come from Africa isn't just a piece of trivia. It undercuts some of the most stubborn illusions humans have about themselves. The genes that let a Tibetan villager thrive at high altitude, the ones that help a person of West African ancestry fight off certain diseases, the ones that shape facial features in East Asia or hair texture in Europe. Every one of those variants is a recent modification of an older African template. There is no them and us at the deepest level. There is only a single, battered, brilliantly adaptable lineage that survived a near-death experience in Africa and then tried out different strategies in different environments. When you look at someone from a background very different from your own, you're looking at a distant cousin whose ancestors walked out of the same continent, carrying the same fused chromosome, the same bottleneck scars, the same capacity for language, art, love, and cruelty. Understanding that doesn't magically solve conflict or erase injustice, but it does change the frame. Borders, races, nations, they're all very recent inventions layered on top of an unimaginably long African prehistory. There's also a philosophical weight to this story. The idea that our species began in one place, endured a crisis that almost erased us, and survived only because a few thousand people in Africa learned to cooperate, to share, to teach, to care for one another. It suggests something about what it means to be human. It suggests that our greatest strength was never brute force. It was connection, information flowing between generations, compassion extending beyond immediate self-interest, the ability to imagine futures better than the present and to work toward them. Those capacities didn't appear in a vacuum. They were forged in African nights around African fires, under African skies, in landscapes that demanded both toughness and tenderness. So when we talk about climate change today, or pandemics, or global inequality, we're not facing truly new problems. We're facing updated versions of old challenges our African ancestors confronted in their own way. Their solution was cooperation and shared knowledge on a planetary scale measured in stone tools and stories. Ours may be cooperation and shared knowledge on a planetary scale measured in satellites and data networks. In both cases, survival depends on remembering that we are one extended family. Africa is not just where humans began. It is where the idea of us began. The us that was small, fragile, and almost didn't make it. The us that learned, painfully, that no one survives alone. That story didn't end when some of us walked away from the continent. It's still unfolding in African genomes, in indigenous practices, in newly uncovered fossils, in the ways African scientists and communities are shaping medicine, technology, and philosophy today. The cradle of humanity never really stopped rocking. We just forgot to listen to its rhythm, and that brings us to one last question. If all of us, everywhere, trace our roots back to the same African dawn, what does it mean to return to that cradle? Not with our bodies, but with our understanding, our respect, and our imagination. So now, as we drift toward the end of this journey, let's come back to the simplest, strangest, most powerful truth of all. We're all African. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Every person alive today, from every nation, every background, every shade of skin, traces their lineage back to the same continent, the same scattered bands of survivors, the same fragile network of tiny groups clinging to life somewhere in ancient Africa. The borders we draw, the labels we cling to, the differences we obsess over, they're all recent, they're all surface. Underneath we carry the same bottleneck scars, the same fused chromosome, the same ancient adaptations that once kept a few thousand desperate humans alive through the worst crisis in our history. When you really let that sink in, it's humbling. The person you disagree with online, the stranger passing you in the street, the face in some distant crowd on the other side of the world, if you go far enough back, you're not just related. You share great-grandparents. Not poetic ancestors, but real people whose feet walked African soil, whose eyes watched African sunsets, whose hands shaped the first tools that would one day lead to cities, satellites, and the device you're using right now. In the quiet of the night, that realization does something strange to all our usual divisions. It softens them, makes them look small. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors didn't survive by building walls. They survived by building networks, by sharing water sources, fire, stories, and genes across vast distances. They survived by remembering over and over again that without each other, they were nothing. That's still true. The deeper we look into our hidden past, the more the old hierarchies start to crumble. The idea that some peoples are newer or less advanced, or somehow separate from the great human story, it doesn't hold up against the fossils, or the DNA, or the stone tools shaped by hands just like yours, 300,000 years ago, somewhere in an African valley now buried by time. What we find instead is a single, tangled lineage. One cradle, many branches, one origin, countless possibilities. And we're still only scratching the surface. New digs in forgotten deserts, ancient DNA pulled from a tooth the size of a grain of rice, satellite scans revealing buried cities beneath modern towns. Every year, Africa gives up a few more of its secrets. Every discovery rewrites a paragraph of the story we thought we knew. Somewhere, under layers of dust and silence, there are still clues waiting about lost cultures, unknown migrations, maybe even other human cousins we haven't met yet in the fossil record. So as you lie here, eyes growing heavy, let your curiosity stay awake a little longer. Let it wander back across continents and millennia, back to dense forests lit by small flickering fires, back to grasslands where early humans watched the skies, reading the seasons in the shape of the clouds, back to shorelines where someone for the first time might have wondered what lay beyond the horizon. If you'd like to keep exploring these forgotten paths with me, you can gently support this journey. Tap like if this story stirred something in you. Subscribe if you want to hear more hidden chapters from the deep past, told softly in the quiet hours. And if you feel like sharing, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from right now. A city, a village, a remote place under the stars. Imagine all those dots on the map scattered across the planet, yet all of them pointing back to the same cradle. As you drift towards sleep, picture that ancient African landscape. The air cool after sunset. The smell of smoke from a small campfire curling into the dark. Distant animal calls fading into silence. A few human figures, your ancestors, sitting close together, trading stories about water, weather, spirits, and tomorrow's hunt. Above them, the same moon you see now. The same constellations, slightly shifted by time, but still familiar. Their world was harsh, uncertain, and often terrifying. But they endured. They found warmth in one another. They passed down knowledge, song, and courage through unbroken chains of memory that somehow leads all the way to you, to this moment, to this breath. You are the continuation of that story. You're a child of the cradle. Let that thought wrap around you like a blanket as the long ancient night closes in and the first light of old African mornings waits patiently just beyond your dreams.